Welcome and thank you for joining today's training, Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources, Phase 4. Before we begin, please ensure that you have located the chat panel at the bottom right corner of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. To submit a written question during the training, please type your message in the message box provided, select everyone. When you're done with your question, please press enter on your keyboard. All audio lines will be muted until the open verbal Q&A portion of the call. We will give you instructions on how to ask a verbal question at that time. With that, I'll turn the call over to Rada Madrigal. Rada, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carice. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rada Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I am joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during Q&A or to provide clarity when needed as we discuss this topic. We'll do a quick round of introductions here so that we can get started. Let me just open my participant window. I'm going to go alphabetically through the folks that I have on my panel list. So Anya, if you could say hello.
Good morning, this is Anya Gilbert with the CAISO.
And then Bridget.
Hi, this is Bridget Sparks, Policy Developer for the CAISO.
Thank you. And Heidi?
Good morning, everyone. This is Heidi Carter of the California ISO.
And Jenny?
Hi, this is Jenny Araj with the Market Analysis team at the ISO.
And Jill?
Yes, hi, good morning. This is Jill Powers with the Policy team at the ISO.
And Katie?
Hi there, this is Katie Wickler with the Market Analysis team at the CAISO.
And Kevin?
Hey, good morning, guys. This is Kevin Head from the California ISO, and I'm in the market analysis team as well.
And then we have Neela.
Hey, this is Neela from IT at California ISO.
And Tor.
Good morning. This is Tor Garman at the California ISO.
And then we have Trang.
Good morning, this is Trang Vo from the Program Management Office.
And then finally, we have Tyler.
Good morning, this is Tyler DeBester from the Market Services at the California ISO.
All right, so that is everyone who is gathered here today with us. And we're here to talk about the changes being implemented for the Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources Phase 4 initiative. In an effort to increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted on our website so that you can review it in the future, and for those who are not able to join today's call. The slide presentation that we will be sharing is posted now on CAISO.com and can be found in the Learning Center under New Modules, on the Release Planning page under the Fall 2021 Releases, and it's also posted under the Stakeholder Initiative page for ESDR. Couple of notes for the call. All of your lines have been muted in order to minimize background noise. We are going to be taking both verbal questions or written questions in the chat pod. As Carice said, if you'll send a question when you put it in to everyone so that we can see that, or if you want to raise your hand using your WebEx tools in order to ask a verbal question, you can do that as well. First, some high-level objectives that we wanted to cover. I wanted to share with you that the goal of the overarching ESDR initiative is to both improve and enhance the ISO market participation models for both storage and distributed energy resources. This Phase 4 iteration that we are implementing consists of 4 main items. Some demand response program designs have a limited number of activations and also a set number of hours available for dispatch within a day. We are going to be implementing parameters that better reflect the operational characteristics of these DR resources. The changes will give DR resources a new daily max runtime constraint. Also, currently, state of charge is managed through self-scheduling, which doesn't allow for flexibility for the ISO or for the storage operator. It also doesn't allow the setting of a min or max range for the state of charge. So we are implementing an optional end-of-hour state of charge bid parameter that will be submitted as a min and max megawatt hour range. The ISO has market power mitigation measures that apply to most resources when uncompetitive conditions are detected, but they don't currently apply to storage resources. The creation of a default energy bid cost methodology for storage resources will allow the market power mitigation measures to extend to storage as well. And finally, today, NGRs, or non-generator resources, have to execute a participating load agreement and a participating generator agreement. We are streamlining this process so that NGRs are only required to complete a single participation agreement. Today's training will cover the following topics at a high level. We're going to talk about, like I said, a high-level review of changes. I'm going to go into a description of each of the change by its participation model. We will also then talk about application-specific details before we wrap up the call with some discussion about market simulation for this initiative. Here are a couple of acronyms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. If you are following along with the posted slides, if you come across something that you're unfamiliar with, you can refer back to these couple slides at the beginning for reference. So first, I've divided this training into a couple of sections. We're first going to talk about the overall changes at a high level to provide context and some background, and then we'll discuss application-specific details and what you'll be expected to do from a bidding perspective, and finally, we'll close with information about the market simulation for this effort. A bit about the timeline here. There was a tariff amendment filed with FERC March 19th of this year, and that just addressed the simplification of those NGR agreements. That was approved on May 14th. And then most recently, we filed a tariff amendment with FERC on Friday, August 27th, and that is for the remainder of this ESDR 4 implementation. In that filing, we requested that FERC provide approval by October 28th, so that's the deadline that we're looking at there. MarketStim for this effort is going to be in the August 30th to October 1st window with a production activation target of November 1st. Now, I did want to point out that during last week's release user group meeting, there was a mention of an approximately 2-week delay in the project schedule. We are currently working with our vendors and the project teams to address these issues, but I would ask that you stay tuned to those release user group meetings for the most up-to-date information with regard to deployment date, and if any of that changes, that's where you will be notified. So let's kick it off with some background here. We are going to be implementing parameters to better reflect demand response resource operational characteristics. As I mentioned earlier, some DR programs have that limited number of activations or a set number of hours that they are available for dispatch within a particular day. So this new parameter provides those resources a daily max runtime constraint. It will allow the DR resources to identify the maximum number of hours per day that the resource could be curtailed. This is an optional master file parameter, and there is a minimum of 1 megawatt curtailment size threshold in order to mitigate system performance impact with that. We're also implementing an optional end-of-hour state of charge parameter for storage resources. This is going to be submitted as a minimum and maximum megawatt hour range. It must respect the ancillary services or AS awards and the physical minimum and maximum charge constraints. The market optimization is going to protect those AS awards if there is a conflict with the end of hour state of charge bid parameter. And both self-scheduling and the end of hour state of charge parameter do impact the bid cost recovery settlement. We'll go over those BCR impacts a little bit later when we discuss the settlements piece. I mentioned that we'll be implementing a new default energy bid cost methodology for storage resources. So the default energy bid methodology approximates storage resource costs according to energy procurement costs, marginal costs to charge and discharge, also referred to as cycling costs, as well as opportunity costs. A note here that the opportunity costs are excluded from the day-ahead default energy bid formulation. Those will only be part of the real time, and we'll cover how these DEBs get calculated when we go through the application-specific pieces. So I'll provide a little bit more detail on that as we get into that section. This new default energy bid or DEB methodology can be selected by storage resources, or of course any of the other existing default energy bid types for which they are eligible. And there will be a caveat there that storage resources that are less than 5 megawatts are exempt from this local market power mitigation. And I mentioned that we were going to be streamlining the market participation agreements for those NGR resources. Instead of having to execute both a participating load agreement and a participating generator agreement, that process has now been streamlined so that NGRs can participate with a single agreement. With the new streamlined process, it allows NGRs that operate as a storage device to choose to operate only as that, or NGRs that operate as a storage device or choose to operate only as a generator will execute the participating generator agreement. NGRs operating as dispatchable demand response will execute the participating load agreement. So a difference between the participation models there. And any NGRs today that have existing agreements are not going to be required to go back and execute new ones. This is just a going forward process change. Now, I thought it would be helpful to share the same information in the context of the participation models. So the next couple of slides cover the same things we talked about, but categorized by type of participant. Batteries or non-generating resources, NGRs, have two participation models. There is REM and non-REM. So REM is regulation energy management. That can be awarded for regulating energy up or regulating energy down only. And for non-REM, these can be awarded for energy or ancillary services, including regulation awards. The changes here with ESDR 4 relate to the non-REM participation model. These non-REM limited energy storage resources, or LESRs, will have access to a set of biddable parameters for maximum and minimum end of hour state of charge. And we're going to also be modifying the bid cost recovery calculation when submitting either the end of hour state of charge or with self-scheduling. And again, I'll go into those BCR impacts when we get to the settlements piece. The non-REM LESRs will be subject to market power mitigation and have access to that new default energy bid that I discussed that will be formulated to include both energy costs, variable costs, which includes cell degradation or cycling costs, as well as opportunity costs that are applicable to real-time default energy bids. Details of the costs, including formulas, are included in the ESDR 4 business requirement specification. If you're curious to look at those, I have a link to that BRS in the reference section of the slides toward the end of the presentation. And again, we mentioned that storage resources that are not net suppliers and are smaller than 5 megawatts are going to be considered to be in this safe harbor category and will be exempt from local market power mitigation. Moving to the next participation model for PDR or PDR LSR curtailment or RDRR. For all of these models, there will have the optional maximum daily runtime parameter that will be added to the market optimization. And in the market optimization, it's the opportunity cost calculator that's going to include this optional constraint. Now that was a high-level overview of the changes. Before we get into talking about the application-specific details, I wanted to take our first question break here and see if anybody had any questions about what we've covered so far.
To ask a verbal question, please use the raised hand icon above the chat panel. I will let you know when your line is unmuted. So far, we have no verbal questions.
Thank you, Carice. And it looks like I don't see any questions there in the chat, so we'll move forward. That was just, like I said, the high level. I'm assuming folks are eager to find out about the application-specific details, so we'll go through those now. We'll talk about master file changes, cyber. We'll talk about the market, IFM RTM engine. We'll talk about CMRI and Oasis. And after, as we move through each one, I'll give you an opportunity to talk or to ask questions for each particular application. So we'll start off with master file. Here I wanted to share with you that the scheduling coordinators of those LESR resources will have the ability to register the storage-based variable cost as an optional parameter that has an effective start and end date. This parameter represents the cost the resources will incur while producing energy. For most resources, the bulk of these costs will include cell degradation costs or the wear and tear that the cells of the battery cells experience as the resources charge and discharge. However, there are other costs related to the LESR resource charging or discharging that may also be included in this component. This variable cost submission, again, is for the non-REM LESRs. It is an optional parameter, and the unit of parameter is going to be in dollars per megawatt hour. That will be the unit of measurement. To register this new optional item, we'll follow the same lead time similar to other resource registration parameters. The resources SC shall also submit manufacturer warranty information, any other available data, and supporting documentation to justify those requested costs. If there are no storage-based variable costs submitted by the LSR, the system will set it to 0. And you, the SC, will have the ability to view that submitted storage-based variable cost as you review that in master file. We ask that you submit these cost parameters through CITI or the customer interface or customer inquiry and dispute information application. Submit that through the CITI ticket, and then, like I said, you'll have the ability to view that data by downloading the GRDT from master file and taking a look at that submitted parameter. The new storage default energy bid option also applies to non-REM LESRs in the CAISO BAA. It is a modifiable resource attribute that can be submitted via the GRDT. In addition to storage, which is what we are adding, the other Deb options for those resources are the variable cost option, the LMP, or the negotiated rate option. When we get to the part where we discuss IFM and RTM, I have a couple of examples of how the Deb is calculated, so we'll get into that in just a moment. This new storage DEB, if you are going to use that, it needs to be ranked first in order to activate it. The system will not allow the storage DEB option to be given any other ranking other than the first ranking if you're going to select it. If there is no rank specified for the non-REM LESR, the system is going to set the default rankings as number 1, variable cost, and number 2, LMP. The storage DEB option ranking does not apply to EIM and will be rejected if submitted by any EIM BAAs, non-REM LESRs. Lots of acronyms in that sentence, my apologies. Those EIM resources can utilize either that negotiated DEB or the other existing DEB options, which you see here on the slide, which are the variable cost or the LMP. So the storage DEB option is something that's only available at this time inside of the CAISO BAA. And here again is another mention about that safe harbor. So under safe harbor, the resources that will be exempt from market power mitigation and the DEB ranking submission, if they're not, if the resource type is not, or sorry, if the resource is a non-REM LESR, I'm getting tongue-tied over this particular bullet. If the resource's registered Pmax capacity is less than or equal to 5 megawatts and their ultimate parent company is not a net supplier. Additional master file changes. We'll talk about the max daily runtime, which is that new optional parameter for the PDR, LSR, and RDRR resources. That will have an effective start and end date for resources that are of either of those types and have a curtailment capacity or registered Pmax greater than or equal to 1 megawatt. The max daily runtime represents the maximum daily number of hours the resource can be committed and or dispatched. Valid values for this submission are either null or integers from 1 to 23 hours. Again, this is an optional master file parameter for those resources. If nothing is entered, the system will store it as null, and the registration and master file follows the same lead time and process, similar to other resource registration parameters. Now, this was the last slide that I had on the master file, so I wanted to stop here and see if anybody has any questions about the master file updating for these resources.
I'm seeing no questions.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat either.
Okay, thanks, Carissa and Heidi. We'll move on to cyber. In cyber, there will be real-time optional hourly bid parameters by these non-REM LESRs, SCs. Minimum end-of-hour state of charge in megawatt hours and max end-of-hour state of charge, also in megawatt hours. These can be submitted as optional hourly bid parameters in real time. We state that these SCs of the non-REM LESR shall not use the end-of-hour state of charge bidding parameters in such a way to undermine their must-offer obligation or use them to withhold additional RA capacity that is not scheduled in either the IFM or RUC. There are no end-of-hour state of charge bid parameters for the day-ahead market. This is just a real-time optional bid parameter. In cyber, there will be some validation rules for the end-of-hour state of charge bid parameter. They'll automatically be validated using the following rules, making sure that the resource is not a REM LESR type. So again, it's only available for non-REM. So we'll make sure that it's falling into that category. There'll be a comparison of the min and max end-of-hour state of charge, the min end-of-hour state of charge compared to the biddable minimum energy storage limit. and a bunch, I won't read each one of these bullets for you, but as you can see, we're comparing the state of charge with the registered and the biddable minimum and maximum energy storage limit in order to make sure that these bid parameters have been submitted accurately. This is my last cyber slide before we move on to IFM RTM. Does anybody have any questions about cyber before we move on to the next section?
I'm seeing no questions.
I'm seeing no questions in this either, and I have been putting some information in there. So for everyone, if you make sure that you have your chat open, you'll be able to see updates as we're posting some of this information. Thanks.
Thanks, Heidi. All right, now we'll talk about how these, we wanted to make sure that you are aware of how the real-time biddable parameters are handled in the context of the RUC-generated binding minimum end-of-hour state of charge requirement. So you may recall this minimum state of charge requirement was introduced as part of the summer readiness effort. The ISO uses results from the day-ahead RUC process to determine days when this minimum state of charge requirement will be enforced. Minimums will only be imposed on days when RUC is under gen infeasible. This happens infrequently, but indicates tight system conditions. So we wanted to point out here that in real time, if there is an overlap between the RUC-generated binding minimum end-of-hour state of charge, which is something that is awarded in the day-ahead time frame, if that overlaps with the biddable hourly real-time min and or max end-of-hour state of charge, or the biddable daily min and or max energy storage limit, the market is going to give precedence to that binding RUC-generated reliability min end-of-hour state of charge awards. So day-ahead RUC minimum state of charge awards, if they are created in that day-ahead time frame when we are experiencing tight system conditions, those will take precedence over any of these overlapping biddable real-time elements. If you want more information about the minimum state of charge requirements, we did do some training on that earlier in the year. You can refer to the presentation in the Learning Center that's labeled Summer 2021 Readiness Part 1. That will go over more of the RUC min end-of-hour state of charge if you're curious about that. Here we just wanted to highlight that will take precedence over these real-time biddable parameters. And next we wanted to talk to you about the default energy bid option for storage. That will cover the entire operating range for these non-REM LESRs. The day-ahead and the real-time market DEBs for storage option cover that entire operating range, so charging as well as discharging from the registered PMIN to the registered PMAX. The separate day-ahead and real-time DEBs account for energy cost, which is the cost to purchase energy while charging, including accounting for round-trip efficiency. It also includes storage-based variable costs, including cell degradation cost, which we also refer to as cycling cost, and price-based opportunity cost, which is only for the real-time market DEB. So the difference here between the day-ahead and the real-time storage DEB is kind of twofold. The day-ahead DEB uses prices from the market power mitigation run of the day-ahead market, whereas the real-time market DEB uses the final LMPs, so after all the day-ahead market runs. And the real-time DEB also includes an additional element. That additional element, like we pointed out on this slide here, is that price-based opportunity cost, which is different than the opportunity costs caused by use limitations that we calculate in our opportunity cost calculator. So the real-time market DEB factors in the highest LMPs of the day, And both of those differences can result in differences in the final Deb curves between the day-ahead market and the real-time market Deb. And we'll go through a couple of examples of how those get calculated so you can kind of get a feel for how that works. Here I also wanted to mention that the soft bid cap of $1,000 will apply to those calculated Debs. So let's dive into some examples here. We have two examples of calculating the Deb, one for day ahead and one for real time. This example here is for that day ahead Deb calculation using a sample day ahead market power mitigation LMP price curve. So this is an example using this curve. The blue section here indicates that the resource will be charging at the least expensive continuous block of LMPs at a value of 4.44 hours, which is based on the adjusted energy charging duration, which we'll calculate on the next slide. And then the green section indicates that the resource will discharge at the most expensive continuous block of LMPs at Pmax. So based on that sample curve, this is how those calculations are made, and we'll take a look at how the calculation works here. So using the sample parameters that are listed on this slide for a sample resource, along with the formulas that are provided over there on the left, and I'm not going to walk through each one letter by letter, number by number, but you can see parameters plugged into the formulas on the left. We can see that the adjusted energy charging duration is calculated at 4.44 hours. The calculation will select the lowest continuous block of LMPs across those 4.44 hours to calculate the energy cost. So the lower block was from hour ending 5 through 9, as we saw on the chart on the previous slide. Therefore, the energy cost is calculated as $15.50 per megawatt hour based on the calculation that we have here. So take a quick peek back at the slide. You can see in blue, that's where we have determined the charging time will be. And then we'll talk about the green section next. So calculating that day ahead Deb, the calculation varies slightly between the charging and the discharging segments, because that charging portion should not include the variable operations cost. And if you recall, the price-based opportunity cost is not included in the day-ahead calculation. So we've got the calculation here with a day-ahead Deb, one for charging, which is there in the top listed in negative megawatts, and the second one would be for discharging. Now, before we move to before we move to the real-time market example, are there any questions from the audience about calculation of the day-ahead Deb?
I'm seeing no questions.
I don't have any questions in the chat either.
All right, so let us move on to the real-time market Deb calculation. This example is for real-time based off the sample day-ahead LMP price curve. The blue section here indicates that the resource will be charging at the least expensive continuous block of LMPs at a value of 4.44 hours, which we base on the adjusted energy charging duration. You saw how that was calculated for the day-ahead Deb. It's a similar calculation for real-time, and we'll show that to you in a moment. And then the green section indicates that the resource will discharge at the most expensive continuous block of LMPs at a value of 4 hours, which is based on the adjusted energy discharging duration, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, the red arrow that we see here on the chart indicates the price-based opportunity cost, which is chosen based on the adjusted energy discharging duration value. So that is based off of the fourth highest price. So you can see that that's there in hour ending 17, and we'll show you how that works on coming slides. So we saw this calculation earlier, the energy charging duration adjusted for round trip efficiency. We've got the same numbers here with that we had with the previous example. The calculation determines the 4.44 hours, and the number that indicates the lowest continuous block of day-ahead LMPs was, again, that hour ending 5 through 9. So we arrived there at an energy cost of $15.50 per megawatt hour. Now, calculating the energy discharging duration, we then round down to the nearest integer. So based on the value of the adjusted energy discharging duration, we then choose the fourth highest day-ahead LMP to set the price-based opportunity cost. I pointed to that in the red arrow on the previous slide as hour ending 17. The fourth highest day-ahead LMP is $60 per megawatt hour and hour ending 17. So that gets calculated as part of the real-time DEB. Again, the calculation varies slightly between the charging and discharging because the charging portion does not include variable operations cost. Now, when we factored in, you can see that these calculations, while the numbers are not exactly the same, we end up arriving at the same number for both segments in this particular example. And we have that to highlight that when the DEB is the same price in both of those segments, it actually gets consolidated into a single segment before it gets used by the market or published downstream. So in this example, that DEB would be between negative 10 megawatts to positive 10 megawatts at $66 per megawatt hour. So that the calculation varies slightly, but if we come up with the same number for both portions, that gets consolidated to a single segment as the market consumes that information. Do we have any questions about calculating the real-time DEB before we move on to the next section where we talk about looking at data that will be provided in CMRI?
Hi there, Rhoda. This is Heidi. We did have one. Actually, it was for the day ahead. There's something that's going on with our chat. So we did have a question from Dave Francis, and he's saying on page 36, back in your example, is this a forecast DAM LMP?
Let me go back to page 36, and I'll get a SME to go over this example here. So on page 36, is this a forecasted day-ahead LMP?
Hi, this is Katie Wickler. I can take this question. Thanks, Dave. So with regards to this price curve here, these are actually the ISM prices from the MPM pass. So essentially what's happening is, the market is running its MPM pass, results in LMP prices, and then the DEB is calculated, the day-ahead DEB is calculated based on those prices. So it's not actually forecasted, it's the actual trading days prices from the MPM pass.
Okay, thank you for that, Katie. And then there's a question on 42, so let's go to that. And then Heidi, if you could read off the question that corresponds with 42 for Katie.
Absolutely. The question on page 42 is, so the charging price in the RTM DEB would be anything $66 or under? Is that correct?
Right. So again, this is the default energy bid calculation. So, the resources are free to bid how they wish. If the resource is mitigated in the charging, segment from, in this example, negative 10 megawatts to 0, if it's mitigated in that section, then it would be mitigated to that real-time DEB price of $66 per megawatt hour. If you're asking specifically about the charging price, that would be that component of the $15.50.
Does that get to your question, Dave?
All right, I think that covers it. And then there's
Actually, he said, Dave did respond. He says, not sure yet. It's the max value. It helps. Well, he doesn't have a microphone, so, but he said he'll think it over. So thank you very much for your response, Dave.
All right, so we'll have more opportunity to ask further questions as we move through the rest of this presentation.
We asked one more question. One just came in. Rada says, are there any cases in which the day-ahead DEB would be consolidated into a single segment?
Yeah, this is Katie. I can take a shot at that one. I believe that, Michael, if we're calculating we're calculating for the charging and discharging segment separately, if those values are the same, I believe that we would consolidate that into a single segment.
And just, there's one more question. What will the mitigated bid price for charging under the following scenarios when the DEB is for -10 megawatts to 0 megawatts is 66 megawatts per hour? Their A, charging bid price is $60 by megawatt hours. B, charging bid price is 70 megawatts per hour. That was a note from Wei Zhao.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're asking what the charging bid would be mitigated to. So in that instance, if that resource is found to be potentially exercising local market power mitigation and is mitigated to its DEB, it would be mitigated to the $66. So if the charging bid price was below the DEB, we wouldn't mitigate up to the 66. If it's put in at 70, then that's the case that we would be mitigating down to the DEB price of $66.
Okay, thank you very much, Katie. This time I don't see any other questions coming in. Just to point this out for future questions, if you could be sure to send those to everyone in the drop-down, that way make sure that we can see those come in. So again, the selection will be everyone for the questions so that we can all see it. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Heidi. We'll move now to talking about CMRI, and of course, if any other questions come through, we'll address those as well. In CMRI, we wanted to point out that we'll be adding the new storage default bid type to the default energy bid curves report. So the day-ahead DEBs with all existing default bid types, as well as the new storage default bid type for T+1 trade date, and the real-time market DEBs with all existing default bid types, as well as that new storage default bid type for the trade date. The report structure has not changed, but you'll see the storage element get added to the default bid type field. Now, I do want to point out that there will be some changes to the way that this publishes. So we put together this table for you because this was information that previously was not published. So at the top under current, you can see that storage resources for day ahead and real time did not have a DEB before, therefore it was not published. For all other resources in the day ahead time frame, it was at approximately 8:45 a.m. on the day prior to the trade date. And in real time, it was at approximately 9:40 p.m. on the day prior to the trade date. With the calculation of these storage DEBs, they will be published a little bit on a little bit of a different time frame. So the future talks about how the storage DEB information will be published. It will be published with the day-ahead market results, so at approximately 1 p.m. Pacific on the day prior to the trade date. And from the real-time market perspective, those DEBs will also be published at that same time. So storage resource data gets published at about 1300 when the day-ahead market results publish, which is different from other resources, which there is no change to that publishing timeline. This is my last question about, my last slide about CMRI. So we'll take a pause here to see if there are any questions. Katie, there was a note that you had put in, and I can't tell maybe if someone had messaged you directly and you were sharing a question with the group about the Deb.
Oh, it just looked like someone had their hand up in the attendee list, but I don't see that hand raised currently.
Okay.
Oh, actually, yeah, I see Callie Wells has her hand raised. And I believe the reminder is to press #2 on the telephone keypad to enter the queue, if I have that right.
Callie should be unmuted. If you're on the phone only, please press #2. Otherwise, use the raise hand icon. But Callie, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, hi, this is Callie Wells. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Sorry, I tried to raise my hand earlier, back on when you're going over the real-time Deb. So a couple questions. Since you guys are using the 4 highest continuous priced hours and the 4 lowest continuous priced hours, could it be that case where that 4th highest LMP is actually not within the same block?
Hey, this is Katie. Yeah, I'm trying to recall when I went through these examples myself. I think that could be the case. And, in that case, we would just kind of take the 4 ranked hours, even if they're not continuous.
Okay, but the Deb is based on the 4 highest continuous price hours? Is that based on like a rolling average?
I believe so. Kevin, do you want to jump in here and help clarify?
Hey, Callie, it's Kevin Head. It's my understanding, so the charging and discharging are a little bit different. So the charging portion is the 4th, in a situation where the resource has a 4-hour charging duration, we would find the 4th lowest priced continuous block of hours. For the discharging portion, we just rank the 4th highest. We just rank all the prices regardless of whether they're continuous or not, and pick the 4th highest price in that segment. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. For that one component of the Deb that is not in the day ahead calculation, the price opportunity cost.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, that's helpful. That does make sense. And my other question is, I guess, so when you guys combine the real-time Deb into a single segment, so it's going to have one price from the charging to the discharging range, have you guys done any simulations yet to make sure that there aren't any odd outcomes from a market optimization perspective? I'm trying to figure out how the market would determine whether or not, in that case, the resource should have a charging schedule versus a discharging schedule, since it's priced all the same. I don't know. I think for storage resource that seems odd. So I'm trying to figure out if you guys have done simulations to make sure that the market optimization is able to handle that.
Hey, Callie, I'll reply back to this. Our market testing group isn't on the line right now, so I'm not sure. I can't really, attest to what types of tests they're running, but we will, consider whether this test is needed from kind of a functional perspective, and then, get back to the group on that.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry. That's a good question.
No, that's great. I didn't realize they weren't on the call yet, because I thought during the policy discussion that was brought up, and it was the understanding that there would always be some differential between the charging segment and discharging segment. So yeah, I guess once it gets to the testing phase, or a little bit, maybe MarketStim, we can figure that one out. But thank you.
Thank you.
Did we have any other verbal questions?
I'm seeing no other verbal questions.
All right. How are we doing in the chat, Heidi?
We do have one question that's come in to everyone. Will this report be published during the MarketStim?
Yes, it will.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
If you have any other questions, please mark those to everyone, so we'll make sure we can get those to you. Thanks.
All right, so that was our last CMRI slide. Now we're going to move forward to, I've got one slide about Oasis, and that refers to, we're going to be making a change to the public bids report. These optional hourly bid parameters that are going to be added for those non-REM LESRs are going to be published to that masked public bids report. You'll see the optional min end of hour state of charge and max end of hour state of charge. I've got a screenshot here of that Oasis menu. It is not a report that gets published to the UI, but it can be downloaded in either XML or CSV. The report is published 90 days after the trade date, so you'll be able to see that new data, I would say 90 days after we go live. With this change, you'll start seeing these new elements in that public bids report if you use that in your daily practices. This is my only Oasis slide. Any questions about Oasis before we move on to settlements?
Once again, using the raised hand icon above the chat panel. If you are on computer audio, we'll put you in the verbal queue. If you're on phone only, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. But at this time, I'm seeing no verbal questions.
And I'm not seeing any chat questions either.
All right, thank you, Carice and Heidi. Let's move on to settlements. Now, with regard to the changes being made here, the settlement's impact is going to be to configuration guides. So I'll point out the charge codes or settlement calculations that are going to be affected. It's charge code 6620 for the RUC and real-time market bid cost recovery settlement, and 66200 for the real-time bid cost recovery EIM settlement. There's also changes to the pre-calculation for the real-time market net amount. When I looked the other day, I did see that there was a PRR submitted. It was PRR 1372, submitted on August 27th, that gave those updated changes to the configuration guide for the pre-calc for the real-time market net amount. So if you're curious about that, you can see that in the BPM change management tool. Those are the codes that are affected. I mentioned there was going to be impact to bid cost recovery. So there's some new functionality we'll discuss, and then there's some existing functionality that we'll just reiterate. Started with a new functionality. Here we have an indication that resources will be disqualified from receiving real-time market bid cost shortfall in the following situations. If the resource has accepted real-time market end-of-hour state of charge bids in an hour, they'll be disqualified from the shortfall for that hour and the previous hour. We call those the flagged hours. I wanted to note that this can span trade dates. So if it's spanning from the end of one day into the other, or the beginning of a day, or the beginning of one day, end of another day, it can span trade dates, this hour and previous hour, so just be aware of that. And any hour where both RUC-generated min end-of-hour state of charge requirements and biddable hourly real-time min or max end-of-hour state of charge parameters overlap, we've got that overlap, or in real-time market self-schedules in an hour, they'll be disqualified for the previous hour. Again, this is something that can span trade dates. Now, the previous hour is the new functionality. We already have the existing hour as part of BCR calculation. The real-time bid cost revenue shortfall assessment shall be evaluated at each 5-minute interval of the flagged hours. For bullet 2, the real-time market bid cost recovery rule applies to the entire operating range, discharging and charging for those non-REM LESRs. Again, this is existing functionality. There's no change to the existing settlements rules of day-ahead market BCR as a result of those end-of-hour state of charge constraints or the self-schedule. And there are also no changes to the existing settlement rules of day-ahead metering energy adjustment factors, or MEF, or the real-time market performance metric, or the persistent deviation rules. That is all existing functionality. Any questions about settlements as we wrap up the application-specific piece? And the next thing that we're going to talk about is MarketStim. So I would say this would be a good time to ask questions on anything that we covered, not just this small settlements piece, but anything that we've covered up to this point, because next we're going to turn to market simulation activity. So we'll pause for questions here.
Once again, to ask a verbal question, please use the raised hand icon above the chat panel. I'm seeing no verbal questions.
And I'm not seeing anything coming into the chat to everyone either.
Thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Carice. All right, we're moving on to MarketStim.
Hey,
just some
Robin?
quick updates here. Oh, go ahead.
Hey, this is Kevin Head.
Yep.
I saw that we had an internal message sent to us about something from Alan Paget. And that question was, where did the $30+ come from? Did the answers provided cover this? So I think he's talking about earlier when we were calculating the default energy bid. And that was, I think, slide, let's see, 36A, for example, or
right,
rather, sorry.
What number are we going to?
38, please.
Okay.
So here we have the day-ahead Deb between 0 and 10 megawatts up to the Pmax of the resource in the discharging portion. And that $30 represents the cycling costs of the resource, so kind of the cost to discharge and fully recharge the battery. It's what we call a variable storage operations cost, and that's a value that is registered in master file. And the BPM will have some more details about the types of costs we're expecting and a little bit more about the process there. But it represents the cycling cost of the resource.
Okay, thanks for that.
We had a clarification that came in from Katie as well regarding what Kevin was just discussing. It's, again, that variable storage operations cost, and it should be listed with the other parameters that are listed on the previous slide, number 37. So just to kind of...
Oh, here we go. Storage-based variable cost here, this 30 number. Okay. Got it. All right, so thanks for that clarification. I'm going to go back to slide 51 where we were. Let's just speed here. And we'll talk about market simulation. So market simulation, as with all initiatives, the structured scenarios provide customers with the ability to preview and test bid-to-bill scenarios. For this particular MarketStim, the deadline to register for that was August 24th, so last week. And we have a link to the MarketStim scenarios included in the reference section, and I also have a screenshot that we'll discuss. Users need to be provisioned for access in order to participate in MarketStim, and we do have MarketStim calls that will allow you to stay informed on the timing of activities for this and other fall 2021 release initiatives. And before we get into those MarketStim scenarios, let's check the chat to see if there's any additional questions that might have come in.
Thank you. We do have a new one that just came in, and it was from Michael. It was, will the California ISO use the lower charge limit, the LCL, and upper charge limit, UCL, bid parameters to implement the EOH SOC parameters? Apologies if this was covered in an earlier segment.
Hey, this is Katie Wickler. We unfortunately don't have our market size needs on here, so we'll have to get back to you on this one. I don't want to give you an answer that's incorrect. I believe that the end of hour state of charge parameter is related to or utilizes those lower charging and upper charging limits, but Michael, we'll get an answer back to you on this one.
Yeah, thanks. So Michael, what we'll do is Heidi will keep track of that question and we'll send it off to a SNE, and I will get a list from Carice of everybody who dialed into this call, and so I will email that answer to you with a link to the survey in a couple of days when I get your name and your email addresses from Carice. So we'll get that to you soon. All right, moving forward to the market simulation scenarios. There are two scenarios for this initiative. In the first one, scheduling coordinators will submit a combination of both competitive real-time bids that include those end-of-hour state of charge parameters and self-schedules that overlap for some hours with the RUC-generated binding min end-of-hour state of charge requirements. So the ISO will trigger RUC under gen in feasibility in at least 1 hour in a trade date, and this will flow through from bid to bill so that you can see them in your various reports and on the settlement statement. So you'll see in Oasis, the masked public bids report, a sample, since obviously the report gets published at T+90, but we'll have a sample for you there in MarketStim, along with CMRI reports and ADS instructions for those market results. You'll be able to take a look at your settlement statements to account for those parameters and how that affects real-time bid cost recovery. And the second scenario, scheduling coordinators for those non-REM LESRs will submit both day-ahead and real-time bids. Those bids will be subject to market-powered mitigation, so the ISO will facilitate congestion in order to trigger that mitigation for some of those resources so that you can see those corresponding DEBs associated with that mitigation action and verify that information. Any questions from folks about what we've covered, ending up with, rounding out the MarketStim questions, and also a final opportunity to ask any questions before we close the call?
Once again, please use the raised hand icon above the chat panel to ask a verbal question. And if you're on the phone only, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. I do see a verbal question. Michael, you're unmuted.
Hi, this is Michael Volpe from PG&E. Just had a question on the MarketStim. When will the DEBs be published? Will it be the same schedule as you outlined before at the 1 p.m. or something different?
Good question, Michael. I'm assuming that it'll be a shorter time frame in the MarketStim, but I'm also not 100% sure how that will work. I would say that that's a question that you could bring to the MarketStim call when we discuss this particular initiative and the planning for that. And I think that they'll be able to give you the timing of when you'll expect that. I think that MarketStim for this particular initiative and the trade dates that we'll be using fall a little bit later in that window. So I would suggest dialing into the next MarketStim call so that you can get details on the timing of those reports.
Okay, thanks. And I assume that within this scenario number 2, there'd be 2 kind of sub-scenarios where one is testing of the day ahead and one is real time.
I think that's a good assumption. I don't have the details of how exactly that will work. My apologies. But I assume that, yes, we'll run day ahead. That will obviously have to close, and then we'll run real time. I just don't know how short of a time frame we're going to be looking at as we run those scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
There are no further verbal questions.
Also, nothing in the chat.
All right, folks, we're going to close it out here. Heidi's going to post in the chat a link to a survey that asks you about this training session. And if you have an opportunity to take a few minutes here to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. We take a look at those, and we're always hoping to improve our training so we can meet your needs, and the way that we know if we're hitting that target is by you sharing your feedback with us. So Heidi will post a link in the chat to that survey. If you're able to take it now, we'd appreciate that. I will also send a link to that in the email that I mentioned that we would send out with an answer to the question that Michael had posed just a few moments ago. As I mentioned at the beginning, these slides here are posted to the Learning Center on CAISO.com. And in a couple of days, we'll post the recording there as well. And you will see in the posted presentation, there is a reference section that has links to the BRS, the BPM change management system, the link to where you can find this initiative, and other links as well. If you have any questions on anything presented here today, you can email those to customerreadiness@CAISO.com. This concludes our webinar for today. I really thank you for your participation and your attention. We hope that you found today's session useful and informative, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.